I feel like there are so many victims in this one. It's not just, the people who were actually murdered. This story is so sad on many levels. It is the true tale of a wrongly convicted and executed man and all the aftermath. Today we are going across the pond. Yeah. To 10 Rillington Place. Come with me. Well, hello there. You must have come back for the tea, right? It's Sunday, and you know what that is. It's story time. We're going to get right into this with our tea. If you are new to this channel, I'm Lily. This is Silky Southern Tea. We do true crime, mysteries, all the weird stuff. Today we're starting Not Guilty November. Now, all this month we're going to be talking about cases where someone was wrongfully accused, or it's very, very sketchy to say the least. Let's start with our tea. Today's flavor is licorice root and white tea. Yes, it's kind of, I'm not a big licorice fan, but it kind of fits this story, which is, So are you ready? Here we go. I wasn't going to do a hat today, but I just decided, I don't know, maybe you all like the hats. Today's hat is going to be my crazy hat, because this is a crazy story. So, let's jump on back. We're not going back that far today. We are going to 1924 in Wales. Yeah, all the way in Europe, where young Timothy Evans was born. Now, his mother, I wish I could pronounce her name. I'm going to murder it. So I just, you know what? I'm not going to do it. Young Timothy was born in Wales, and unfortunately, his father just up and deserted the family before he was even born, leaving his mother a single parent. She also had some other children, so here she was, just struggling to make it. Now, Timothy had some problems. First of all, he was probably, I don't know on the level what it would be today, but let's just say he was extremely learning disabled. They said his IQ was about 70, and that's very low, okay? So he already had a deficit, which made going to school very hard. Some people said he was illiterate. Other people said that he could read the comics, like some minor things. Definitely was not very skilled in that department, and that's going to be important to know later on. Timothy grows up. Along with all his other problems, this poor kid also has this condition on his foot, and what it is that really, let me show you a picture. Okay, this is almost like warts, but there's so many of them, and I mean, you can imagine socks and shoes rubbing against it. His foot stayed infected all the time, so he missed a lot of school, and he walked with a limp. I mean, that was very painful. Now, one thing that Timothy did to compensate for his shortcomings is he became very well versed in telling tall tales. So he would make up all kind of stuff. I mean, even as an adult, it said that he used to tell people that his father was actually an Italian count. Yeah. I mean, go big or go home, right? So this is kind of where Timothy was coming from. Now, his mother did remarry when he was a pre-teenager, but he had already had a lot of formative years in this situation. Not doing well in school, he ended up taking odd jobs, just simple labor. He got into a little bit of petty thievery. He wasn't a bad person, he just had a lot of struggles. Now, things would change for Timothy for the better in 1947. Early, I think it was around January, he goes on a blind date and meets this beautiful woman named Beryl. And Beryl seems to have taken to Timothy, and they were inseparable. By September of that year, they were married. And so, nobody was making a whole lot of money, so they ended up moving in with Timothy's mother. But in 1948, what do you think? Beryl is expecting, yeah. And this is the time that the mom is like, okay, you've got to go out on your own. So Timothy and Beryl have not even been married a year, and they move into the only place that they can afford on his meager income, and that is into a flat. For those of you in the States, a flat is an apartment. So they move into a flat at 10 Rillington Place. Now, Rillington Place was what is now a part of Notting Hill, but don't get excited, because Notting Hill back in this time, it was kind of like the slums. With the war and stuff, there had been a lot of bombings, and it was not a nice neighborhood, not a great place. This is where people went who really couldn't afford decent housing. Now, every apartment in this building, which there was only, I think, 3 of them, but every one had its own kitchen and bedroom, but they didn't have an indoor bathroom. So they all had to share an outbuilding, the bathroom. That sounds like fun, right? So this is where they brought their daughter Geraldine into the world, okay? It was a struggle. I mean, Timothy was working as hard as he could, but there were problems in the marriage. Now, later on, the police would say that Beryl was about as smart as her husband, which meant that she probably was not that bright. First of all, Beryl was only 19. She was not a good housekeeper. Timothy would get very angry. He'd come home from work. She's taking care of the baby. She doesn't have much of a life. She's living in squalor. And I imagine that was a little depressing as well. So they used to fight a lot. And the neighbors heard them yelling and screaming at each other all the time. Well, you know, that's what money problems do. So it said that Timothy took to drinking. He drank a lot. Of course, he told these tall tales. The only solace that he really had was in the bottom apartment. There was an older gentleman and his wife, John and Ethel. Now, John was kind of, I guess, maybe a little bit of a father figure to him. I mean, he was older. He was wiser. He had served in World War I. And, you know, he kind of built himself up to Timothy and took him under his wing. So that was really Timothy's only friend. Well, in 1949, believe it or not, things got worse. Beryl announced that she was pregnant again. They could barely make ends meet as it was. So Timothy was worried. It just put more stress on him. And Beryl decided, hey, I'd like to get an abortion. However, abortion was illegal in the UK. Beryl's idea, we think it's kind of sketchy and shady around here. There were some pills on the market that were supposed to help you to abort naturally a fetus. So supposedly she took those pills. Where she got them, I don't know. This is where we get sketchy, but there have been a lot of reports that she attempted to do this, but it didn't work. And probably just a snake oil salesman trying to make a buck. So they're still in this situation. Well, Tim's good friend John decided, you know, hey, let me tell you something. I'm going to help you out, but this is highly illegal. Now, he said when he was in World War I, he was a medic, and that he knew how to perform an abortion. But as it was highly illegal, if anybody found out, they'd both be going to jail. But he tells Timothy, I will do this for you because I see how bad you all are struggling. Timothy didn't really like the idea, but Beryl was all for it. And so he kind of relented and he's like, okay, you know, I guess this is what we're going to do now. Well, John told him, just go ahead to work. And then Beryl and Geraldine will come over to our house and I will fix a place. I'll perform this abortion. And then you come home and it'll all be over. So that's what Timothy did. He went to work. And as he gets home that evening, John meets him outside and says, oh my goodness, I am like something went terribly wrong. She went into septic shock from those abortion pills. Not because of what he did. But basically he told Timothy that Beryl had passed away and that now they were both in trouble and Timothy was going to go to jail, probably get hanged, and so he better get out of town. So Timothy said, what about Geraldine? And John said, don't worry, I'll take care of Geraldine. You go to your family in Wales, like sell your furniture, get some, we can keep this under wraps for a few days, and then you take that money, go to Wales, don't come back. So that's exactly what Timothy did. Timothy's gone, and, he goes to Wales, and his family are like, okay, where's Beryl and the baby? And he said, oh, they're on holiday. Oh, yeah, I don't know how long he thought he could keep that up. But eventually, they're kind of demanding to know. So Timothy goes back to Rillington Place, and he sees John, and he's like, hey, where's Geraldine? I want to see the baby. And John's like, yeah, not right now. Can't see her right now. He's kind of sketchy on that. After several attempts, John finally tells Timothy, look, I gave her to some people, some good Samaritans who were desperate for a child, and they can't have one, and we knew that you couldn't take care of her. We are struggling. We couldn't take care of her, but she's in good hands. Everything's okay. Don't worry. Well, of course, Timothy was heartbroken, but now what could he do? It's not like he could go to the police. Eventually, the guilt just got to him. That and his family pressure, he doesn't know how to answer these questions. He can't see Geraldine, and he's heartbroken. Now he's lost his wife and his unborn child and his first child. So distraught and guilt-ridden, he just goes into the police station, and he tells the police, hey, I killed my wife. He said that basically he and his wife had gotten into a big, huge argument, and he killed her. He didn't really mean to, but that's what happened. And that he had given the baby to somebody else to raise, and he had left town, but now he's back and he wanted to confess. And so the police are like, well, okay. Well, what did you do with your wife's body? And he said, I put it down the sewer, like the drainage thing. There was this right in the street. He said, that is where I put her body. The police take him into custody. They go to the sewer, and first of all, it takes 3 men to lift the lid up. It's so heavy. So they look down in there. There's no body. So they take him back to the station, and, they're like, okay, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Where's your wife? What really happened? So Timothy, now remember, he's prone to making stuff up, too. And this was a well-known fact about him, which really caused him a lot of problems. So the second confession that he made is that, I'm going to admit that my neighbor John and we decided that he was going to perform an abortion on my wife Beryl, but she had taken these abortion pills, she got sick and died. It's not John's fault, but, we panicked, we didn't know what to do, so I ran. He disposed of the body. But still, they couldn't find the body. So they questioned his neighbor John. And his neighbor John is like, oh my goodness, that poor boy. He's touched in the head. And he denied the whole thing. Of course, he was trying to save his own skin, because he was going to be just as liable in her death. But after questioning, John was very, very persuasive, and he made them understand that Timothy was just mistaken. So now we come to the third confession. And this one actually happens because when the police go again looking for Beryl's body, knowing it's not in the sewer, they're looking all around the property, and they come to an old wash house. Now at this time, Timothy is in jail. The police are all on the property. They find the body of Beryl and Geraldine in the wash house. Because apparently they hadn't looked anywhere else but the drain before. So they go back to the police station, and they say, okay, Mr. Timothy Evans, we know you killed your wife and daughter. Well, it was at this point that Timothy found out that Geraldine was actually dead. And he was heartbroken. Now remember, he couldn't read and write, but yet, after he's with the police for a little while, he writes out this confession, okay? And he talks about how they had gotten into a fight and how he had killed her, strangled her, and strangled the baby a day later. And when the police had asked him, "Are you guilty?" He said, "Yes, I'm guilty of murder." But he didn't mean what they thought he meant. Timothy was so overcome with grief and shock that his wife and daughter were both dead. Now, he knew Beryl, but he thought Geraldine was safe, and I think he, hoped that one day he would get to see her again. So it was at this point that he had written this out, but he said, "You know what? No, I am recanting that. This was all John's fault. I left Geraldine with John. He was supposed to take care of her. He told me he found a family for her. He told me that Beryl was an accident. He was trying to perform an illegal abortion. He told them the whole truth." But guess what? By this point, they didn't believe him. Nobody believed him because he had the Italian Count father. Whatever. So even though there were a lot of holes in this case, okay, first of all, Timothy did have an alibi because he was at work that day, the day that Beryl died. And, some of his co-workers actually, signed statements saying, hey, it couldn't have been Timothy because he was at work that day. But a little bit over time, with a little coercion maybe, they recanted that and they said, no, I was mistaken. Timothy wasn't at work that day. Also, Timothy, of course, couldn't afford a lawyer that was in account for anything. So his attorney completely believed he was guilty. He only brought Timothy as a witness. There were no other witnesses for the defense, just Timothy up here, in his state and being obviously of lower intellect, telling people, oh no, this is what happened. It was my neighbor John. And nobody believed him. There were a lot of other holes in this case, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But basically, Timothy Evans had little to no defense. It was a slam dunk case, and it took the jury less than 40 minutes to find him guilty. Nobody was going to give him an appeal because they all felt like 100% this man killed his wife and baby, strangled them, let him hang. And that's exactly what happened in 1950. Timothy Evans, just 3 months after his verdict, he was hung. And that was the end of that. So Rillington Place goes back sort of to the way things were. People struggling. And during this time, John and Ethel, they were kind of on the outs. They had been married for a long time, but actually they had taken a 10-year break from marriage, and they had only for the past few years been back together. So Ethel decides, you know what, I'm done with you. Again, this poverty, this place. She leaves and she goes to stay with family. Meantime, John just stays in the apartment. He had a fairly decent job at the post office, but when all this came up with Timothy Evans and his name was in the paper and he was brought up in this whole thing, the post office is like, you know what, you're fired. There's too much publicity. We don't want anything to do with this whole case. He had lost that job, so he started selling stuff. If Ethel was going to be gone, he was just going to sell her jewelry. So he starts selling that. He starts selling furniture out of his house. And he's barely getting by. It's not a good time for John. So finally, he can't afford it anymore. What he decides to do is sublet his apartment. So there was a couple that were interested in subletting his apartment. So the woman came over and she was looking at it. She was supposed to come by herself, but her husband ended up showing up. So John's like, hey, I'll give you the apartment. You've got to pay me 3 months rent up front, and I'll let you just go ahead and move in. Well, they agreed to that. They paid the money, and John took off. Well, first of all, he didn't pay the rent. That was just a scam. He just took those people's money, and he didn't have any right to sublet his apartment. So when the landlord comes round, he gives this couple 24 hours to get out. What a piece of crap, John. Oh, but it gets worse. Trust me. So John has moved out, and Another tenant in one of the other flats in that building said, hey, I want to use the kitchen down there where John was. So he gets down there, and it's like, this place is a mess. It smells horrible, and it looks horrible. John has been living there for years, and he's like, we get to do something here. So he decides to wallpaper the walls and try to clean it, make it smell better, less like a bachelor pad. And he goes to hang a shelf in the kitchen, and when he does, it won't hang. And he realizes, wait a second, there is something, there's like a hole in the wall here. So he tears back a little piece of paper, and the smell. Yeah. The smell. He thinks he sees something behind that wall. So he tears that wallpaper off that section. Sure enough, there is just a whole alcove that has been covered up by wallpaper in the kitchen, and what he sees, he believes to be a body. So he immediately calls the police. The police come, and they find not one, but 3 women. Yeah. So of course, they're looking at wallpaper guy like, explain yourself. And he's like, literally, I just am fixing this up. Well, they could tell the bodies had been there for a while. So guess who they start to suspect? A man named John Christie. Now, I wish I could say 100% that this is just a monster. Okay, John Christie was a monster, and let's just label him and forget about it. Even though that may be true, there was more to his story. So let's look at that. You're going to need a big swig of tea for this one. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born in 1898 in Yorkshire, England. He didn't have the best upbringing either. Now, his father, even though, he was a great humanitarian, he did things for the community, he was gone a lot, helping people, outwardly it looked great. But you know how things are not the same always at home? Well, this was one of those cases. John Christie's father was a very tough disciplinarian. He was not affectionate, he was cold, he was very, very harsh. And John had, even though he said he loved his mother dearly, she was very controlling, as were his sisters. Now, there were a lot of kids, and John was next to the youngest. It's often said that he was his mom's favorite, but regardless of, whether that's true or not, she apparently was a control freak, and the sisters, and I don't know, the whole family dynamics for John was just harsh, and it made him kind of antisocial. He didn't know how to mesh with other people. He was very aloof and kind of felt like he didn't fit in. Honestly, I can see some parallels to Jeffrey Dahmer in this case, okay? A big result, unfortunately, with this upbringing and his mental status, and who knows what else mentally was going on with him, he became, it is said, very sexually dysfunctional. I mean, he had ED. He just couldn't. And he's very young. So this, it's not very long before guys his age, and even in some later years, began to understand that he had this problem. They made fun of him. They gave him horrible nicknames. They were horribly mean about this, because especially at, and as a teenager, that's like the height for men. And, he just couldn't do anything. So at 17, he wanted to get out of the house, and he enlisted in the military. And he did that for a few years. But, that didn't help his other problems. Now, he had an injury when he was in the military and he got sprayed by some mustard gas. He said it blinded him for several years, but there's not really any documentation on that. It did affect his voice and made it very raspy, which they said that went on for all of his life. Now, one thing that John did have going for him was that he was very, very intelligent. And he was also a spinner of yarns. So he used to tell some good stories himself. And he could make you believe it because he was so intelligent. He just had a lot of knowledge about different things. And that probably came into play a lot later with some of the things that happened. Now, even though he had all of these dysfunctional problems, it seemed like he could only have a normal experience if the woman was a prostitute. Yeah, so I think that's a real psychological problem, okay? So we got a lot going on. But in 1920, John meets a woman named Ethel, and, they strike up a good relationship, things are going good, and they decide to get married. Unfortunately, his problems did not change just because he took a wife, and so he still went to the prostitutes. And I believe that Ethel probably even knew that, but again, we're talking about the 1920s. People really didn't divorce very often, and you just kind of lived with what you got. And you didn't know what you got until you actually married it. Ain't that something? So, time passes, John has this job and that job, and then comes World War II, and he is actually made a war reserve policeman. I mean, all of the younger guys were at war, so you had to have somebody who could, kind of police things. Well, John loved this job because it gave him total control over people. And although not much is said about these years, I just have to wonder what all may have actually happened during the years we know nothing about. A few years into their marriage, Ethel wasn't going to divorce John, but she's just like, I can't put up with you. They were fighting and he was, whatever. They just weren't, grooving. So she does go back to her family, and they were separated for 10 whole years. During this time, John gets into a little bit of trouble here and there. He had worked for a post office. He had stolen some postal orders, and he took a priest's car and stole it, and it all kind of added up. So he went to jail a couple of times. We won't go into all of that because this story's long. But after 10 years of nonsense, he decided that he wanted to, try to make a go of it with Ethel. Can you hear? Oh, Milo's a new kitty here, so yeah, the purring is obnoxiously loud. That's the only good part of this story. John and Ethel are back together. They're living at 10 Rillington Place, and she definitely knows by this time that John does frequent prostitutes, and, she would stay with him for a while, and then she would just need to get away for a few days, a few weeks, whatever, and she would go to her family and vacation, take a holiday, whatever, get away from John. And during this time, John was very busy. But let's skip ahead to Timothy. So Timothy and Beryl move in, of course, and there they are, a young married couple expecting. John is this worldly guy that has this education. He had told Timothy that he was a medic, and he had even brought his medical book out for Timothy to look at, as proof that, yeah, I really know what I'm talking about. Well, Timothy couldn't read and write worth a crap, so, he didn't know. So now we come back to the actual death of Beryl and Geraldine. You have Timothy, who was executed, and John, whose apartment is containing 3 dead bodies, and the police are like, oh, hold the phone. Where is John Christie? And where's his wife? So they're on the hunt for John Christie. Now, John had taken, you remember he had just stolen that 3 months worth of rent. He had taken and he had went to a hotel in another town, and he had been there for a week, and then he starts seeing these newspaper clippings about them finding bodies at his old apartment, and he knew it didn't look good. So he's on the run. Well, it didn't take very long for the police to catch up with him. So then they bring him into custody, and of course he denies everything but the 3 bodies. So who were these people? Well, one of the victims was 25-year-old Rita Nelson. Now, this was John's M.O. After Ethel had decided to go back to her family, he had the house to himself. So he would start having the prostitutes come to his house, and sometimes he would tell them, he was a medic, don't forget that. And sometimes he would say he had a breathing treatment, he could give them to help with their colds or their lung problems, whatever. But what he would do is he would bring them in the kitchen and he would sit them next to the coal stove. Now, coal at this time put off an enormous amount of fumes, like toxic fumes. They would think that they were getting something else, but he'd have them there by the stove, and he'd have this little pipe, this little tube that they would be breathing in, and they didn't realize, because he had added some ingredients in there to keep the smell down, they were breathing straight carbon monoxide. So it didn't take very long for them to fall out in the floor. When they did, like Miss Rita, he immediately strangled her and then assaulted her after death. Let's just say it that way. I mean, this is YouTube. We gotta keep it clean. So Rita was his first victim, and then came 28-year-old Kathleen Maloney. Kind of the same story. Prostitute. Now, one of the ladies actually wasn't a prostitute by necessarily trade. She worked 2 regular jobs. One was in a diner, and that's where he had met her. But she just couldn't make ends meet. So, what's a girl to do? I mean, you couldn't sell feet pics back then. I guess you just kind of sell your favors. I mean, it's really sad. I mean, you have to think she had to be desperate to do that. If you work 2 jobs and you can't keep a roof over your head, then, without selling yourself, it was terrible. It was a terrible life for her. So anyway, she meets John. Same thing happens. Now, after he killed Rita and Kathleen, he put them in the alcove in the kitchen. Well, it couldn't have smelled too good. Then comes Hectorina McLennan. She was 26 years old, and kind of the same story. He brings her in under false pretenses, have some tea, have a breath over here by the stove, and out you go. Well, John Christie couldn't really deny having something to do with these 3 murders, because for God's sakes, they found them in his kitchen. So he really had no choice but to confess. So he actually said that these women had tried to attack him, and it was all in self-defense, okay? All in self-defense. Then they began to ask questions about Ethel. Well, where was your wife during all this time? And he tried to say, oh, she's with family. But when they got in touch with the family, they said, we haven't seen Ethel in years. As a matter of fact, John has been writing us letters, and we knew it was him writing, but he just told us that her ailments had become so bad in her older age that Ethel just couldn't physically write a letter anymore, and so in the letters he would say this is written by John. So they didn't really think a whole lot of it, like they didn't have money for traveling, so I guess people just didn't see each other that much. Well, after confronted with this, John Christie has to admit, oh, yeah, well, I kind of killed Ethel after an argument, and I buried her under the floorboards in the house. Well, that would explain the smell, John. What is it with these smells? Why don't people... I don't get it. Like, in all these cases, people say there was this horrible smell. My God! Don't you know what that is? Jeez. So as the investigation went on, they started looking around John's house, And they notice on this back gate in this little garden area that he's got, there is a human femur. That's the leg bone. Propping the gate open. How long has that been there? Well, according to the neighbors, it's been there. As a matter of fact, when y'all were here investigating Timothy Evans' case, and you were all over the property, the leg bone was right there. And do you remember, Mr. Policeman? The dog dug up a skull. The neighborhood kids brought it to you and said, hey, I think you might want this. And you couldn't be bothered because you were so intent on Timothy Evans being the murderer. You didn't care about all these bones laying in John Christie's backyard, did you? If you had done your job, at least 3 more people would have been alive, not counting Timothy Evans. But enough about that. I get pretty steamed up. So as they're digging around in the backyard, they find several more bodies. And John is like, oh, well, you know, my bad. That kind of did happen. He says that in 1943, this is way before he ever met Timothy and Beryl, Ruth I can't say it right. She was a 21-year-old girl that he was having an affair with. And he said, you know, during this time, they were being intimate and things just got out of hand, and he impulsively strangled her and killed her. Well, what's a man to do but take her outside and try to burn her body and bury it in the backyard? That's normal, right? That murder is what started this ultimate control power trip, thrill kill that he started going on. His next victim was Muriel Edie. And kind of the same thing. He invites her to the house. Now, this is his M.O. years before Beryl. They dig around the yard and they find Muriel as well. It's hard to have any defense for this. And so finally, he does admit that when it came to Beryl, Timothy's wife, he did actually strangle her as well. Because and this is part of Timothy's case, they found out when they, did like the autopsy, they found that she had never had an attempted abortion. Like, that was all a lie. What actually happened is John brought her in the kitchen like he did his other women, told her to take some deep breaths. This is going to help you, relax and, for the procedure. And he strangles her, assaults her, and kills her. Now, he never admits to killing the baby, not ever, even though it was his tie that was tied around her neck in a certain kind of knot. He had actually gone to the police and identified that as Timothy's tie. What a piece of crap, John. Apparently he didn't care that an innocent man hung for his crimes. No remorse whatsoever. He tried to get out of this whole thing by saying, I'm insane, I'm not guilty by reason of insanity. But as the courts looked at him, they said, no, you are far too intelligent. You know what you're doing. You're not insane. I guess that's debatable, but whatever. But it's not enough to keep you from going to jail. So John Christie was quickly found guilty. He hung in 1953, just 3 years after Timothy Evans hung for his crime. John Christie was executed by the same executioner that killed Timothy Evans. So how weird is that? So Timothy Evans' family was clearly upset, after this whole John Christie thing came out, and then they found out, well, there were bones in the yard when you arrested Timothy, but you couldn't look at that, could you? And then they got into all of the police coercion. I mean, it happens. It makes me so angry. It happens in this country as well. I mean, you want to find a killer. Let's just tie it up in a neat little bow. Let's not even look for the truth. And so, his family, Timothy Evans' family, is like, hey, you know what? You just killed an innocent man. But they didn't want to admit that because that made everybody look bad. And they're like, well, you know what? He was actually only tried for the death of Geraldine, not Beryl. And that's what he was executed for. And they said, well, you know what, like, we're going to exonerate him from the whole Beryl thing because we know John Christie did it, but we're not going to say he's innocent. He probably did kill Geraldine. The family was angry. It goes on and on. In 1966, he did receive a pardon posthumously, and the family did receive some compensation. His sisters did for what had happened. But it wasn't until November of 2004 that case was completely reviewed, and it came back exonerating him from both of the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine, saying there is no way that he committed this crime. He was totally innocent. So it took like half a century for them to come around and admit, oopsie, we made a mistake. Even though 3 years later, we hung John Christie for it. So, you know, it's a sad miscarriage of justice. I think there were a lot of victims here. Timothy, definitely. Of course, the women, they were victims of society as well. And even John Christie, as horrible as he was, you know, there are parts of me that think if he had had a different background, if he hadn't had all of this other stuff going on, the physical problems, and if he had had some mental health help, would things have been different? I mean, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot that goes into murder stew, okay? And all these ingredients are what causes a person to become who they are. I mean, in my opinion, the worst crime or the ultimate crime, let me say, that he committed was letting Timothy Evans hang for him. So yeah, that's our story for Not Guilty November. So, what do you think about this story? I know it is so long, and there's just so much to go over, and there are tons of details I did not go into because it's just ridiculous long. But tell me what you think. Did you like that story? Have you ever heard it? Let me know in the comments below. If you did, if you like this kind of thing, please consider subscribing to this channel. And I am out of a voice now, so I will see you in next week's episode. It's a doozy too, so yeah, come back next Sunday. I'll see you later. Until then, stay silky.